Seat. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for coming out. We've got a busy agenda today, so we're going to go ahead and ask that everybody try to keep it somewhat quiet so we can all hear the presentations and the questions that follow. I don't really have any comments to add to what we went through yesterday, except to say that I appreciate the work of the task force and all the folks who've been involved in this over the last 6, 8, 9 months or whatever it's been. And we're getting to the point where hopefully we can start giving this thing some shape, and that's what we'll be working on. Representative Collins, do you have anything to add? As you all know, the first item on our agenda is comments from the governor, so it's not the first time he's been to our task force, but we're glad to have you. We welcome you back to the task force. The governor has said that he will take questions at the completion of his presentation, so you've got time to be thinking about those. Jason, if you'd answer Senator Chesterfield's phone there. Okay, Governor, thanks for coming, and you're recognized. Push your green button there, sir. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Senator Hendren and Representative Collins and members of the task force. First, I want to, as you did yesterday, welcome back Senator Hendren. We missed you, both your leadership, but also your friendship and presence here, and we're grateful for your service overseas and glad for your safe return. And I want to express my appreciation to all the members of the task force, but also those that are on the task force, not on the task force, but have devoted yourself to this task, this study, and you've done extraordinary work over the last about 8 months. So I want to express my appreciation to you, and what we've all shared is a commitment to find solutions to a very challenging problem for our state that impacts the lives of tens of thousands of people. The last time I appeared here, and I was here previously in this room, and I outlined my view that we need to continue the coverage for the expanded Medicaid population, but I indicated that there were 2 conditions for my support of continuing the coverage on the expanded Medicaid population. And let me underscore that if you look at other southern governors and other southern states, the position that I took was contrary. The position that I took bared some political risk, but at the same time, I saw it as the right thing to do for Arkansas. And I know that you are evaluating all of this in the same light. And when I talked about the 2 conditions for support of continuing coverage on the expanded Medicaid population, the first condition is that we find the savings that is needed in order to cover the up to 10% cost that we'll eventually have to assume for that expanded population. And then secondly, the second condition is that we change the rules or we change the waiver so that our Arkansas values of personal responsibility, work, and program integrity are reinforced. And we have worked hard to, since that time, to evaluate my framework. You've also received the John Stephen report that really laid out in detail what's ahead of us, how you identify savings, the options to do that, and the benefit to our state, both in terms of coverage but also in terms of overall budget, that we take care of the expanded Medicaid population. Now, I've gone through much of this, but I wanted to reiterate my recommendations, both in terms of savings and in terms of the program changes that need to be made. And then I'll be delighted to take some questions. The first condition is to create savings in the Medicaid program, not just the expansion population, but the larger Medicaid population. That is where we have to address our savings. And the goal is $835 million over 5 years. Now let me go back to make sure we're on the same page on the savings that are needed. This averages $167 million in savings from the overall Medicaid budget per year. And if you recall, when I last presented, I put it in terms of the impact on our general revenue budget, and that was $50 to $60 million that we need to have in savings from our Medicaid overall budget in terms of general revenue. So if you take $56 million, that equates to the $167 million overall Medicaid budget per year, which equates to over 5 years at $835 million. And so I'll be talking about it in terms of how do we get to that $835 million in savings that is needed. And I think this has been expressed in different ways by different people. Senator Hendren, I heard him express it in one way. I'll put it in my phrase, and I think this is our objective. What we're trying to do and our strategy is to get the best service for the customer at the best price for the taxpayer. And that's our objective, and to balance the service with being efficient in our delivery of those services. Now, there's been a lot of different discussions as to how we arrive at the savings that are needed. There has been a debate and discussion on certain populations that we should consider managed care. There's partnerships with industry as an option to achieve savings. Thirdly, in the partnership with industry is for the best practices that they would bring to the table. Third-party administrators has been discussed. Expansion of the patient-centered medical home model. All of those have been discussed in the John Stephen report. And my bottom line is we have to achieve the savings. As to how you get there is a fair debate that are huge policy decisions, but any path to get to those savings has to be credible, has to be measured, and has to be independently affirmed. But because they have to be real savings and not just something that is wishful. And so we need to get to those savings. Now, I'm going to pause for a second and tell you a story, because I think this illustrates sort of what we really need to come to grips with. And I had a wonderful lunch with a friend, Gaston Gibson, who's a very successful businessman in Arkansas, who's lived a great life and has supported many different endeavors, both charitable and otherwise. And Gaston Gibson was telling me the story. He's from Lake Village, and he went to high school and played football in Lake Village. And Coach Frank Broyles came down to Lake Village and tried to recruit 2 of their star athletes to come play for the Razorbacks. And Gaston sort of stuck up there and said, well, Coach Broyles, I would like to have a scholarship to come play for the Razorbacks, and tried to make sure that he was noticed as well. Coach Broyles told him, son, you're not good enough to play for the Razorbacks. That was a great disappointment to Gaston, and so Gaston went to his dad, who was a big farmer there that wore one of those wide brim hats, and sat in his office there on the farm and told him the story of what Coach Broyles told him, and thinking he was going to get a credible amount of sympathy. Gaston Gibson's dad went out the back porch, threw his brim hat in the air and said, thank you, Lordy, somebody finally told him the truth. And then Gaston proceeded to go back to his dad, and his dad told him, now, son, somebody told you the truth. Now you know what you're good at. You're a good student. You can be a successful businessman. Go up there, get a great degree, and go out and be in success. And that's what he did in life. And I tell that story because sometimes the important thing is for us to realize what we're good at. And as governor, we've got to figure out what government is good at. And so to me, the defining issue that we have to decide is, what does government manage well? What does government do well? And when do we need to utilize the success of others in the private sector to accomplish the mutual objective of delivering service in a good manner for the consumer, but at the same time, a cost-effective manner for the taxpayers? And so that is what we're trying to figure out in our discussions, and there can be disagreements. There can be different ways to get there, but we've got to have that defining point. What do we do well as a government, and what do we need to partner with the private sector on? And I've had a lot of experience in managing big programs. It's been at the federal government level. And the partnership with the private sector is important. You've got to define the parameters, and you can never diminish the importance from the government side of the program management. And that's what we've got to focus on. That's what I want DHS to focus on, is the program management side, that we can supervise and set the priorities and the goals for those private sector partners that are actually delivering the services and hold them accountable. We've made some mistakes in the past. We've learned from those mistakes. We're trying to do things better. And so with that storytelling, and thank you for permitting me to give that story, I want to come back to the savings that we want to achieve and how, where we are in that objective. First of all, long-term care. They came to me and they said, we can identify $250 million in savings over 5 years by implementing best practices, changing some of the ways that we do things. This savings is based upon working with industry that includes an independent assessment for each patient annually, instituting tiers of care at home for individuals who do not require institutional care, and a smart rebalancing between home care and institutional care. We need, while they have put $250 million in savings on the table that they believe they can achieve in cooperation with us, we need a little more time to finalize the details on these savings, having them independently verified, but that is $250 million of the ultimate $35 million that we need to achieve. Secondly, in the dental program, we've identified $20 million in savings over 5 years. This, again, has been through working with the Dental Association and industry groups to accomplish value-based purchasing with performance measures for improved access, prevention savings, and enhanced program integrity. That's $20 million in savings over 5 years. The pharmacy, I've been a good partner in this endeavor. We had a conversation with them. They've identified $110 million in savings, $110 million plus, I should say, in savings over 5 years. This is based upon the expansion of the UAMS EBRX preferred drug list, value-based purchasing, and increasing the medications on the competitive acquisition program. I applaud the pharmacy leaders that have voluntarily come in and said, we can work with you to achieve savings on the aspect of pharmacy. Behavioral health and the developmentally disabled, the John Stephen Group identified potential savings there of $231 million over 5 years for behavioral health, and in terms of the developmentally disabled, $232 million over 5 years. That's a big chunk of what we need to achieve to reach the objective of the $800+ million in savings over 5 years. Likewise, I have met with some of these groups. They've indicated a willingness to try to achieve savings that has not reached the level of satisfaction in terms of credibility and the ability to achieve those savings. And so there's a lot more work to be done there. This is an area that I have discussed managed care as a means of achieving those savings. There's obviously a disagreement on that point, but we have not arrived at the savings that is needed from those two populations that are very high cost, that are important to provide the right kind of services, but we're not there yet in achieving the savings and arriving at a means to achieve those savings with those two groups. And so in summary, if we did achieve the savings that I outlined, then that would be $843 million over 5 years. That is in excess of the $835 million that is needed to accomplish my first condition of the savings needed to make sure there's not an adverse general revenue impact from continuing the expansion coverage for those on Medicaid. We can get there, but we have not arrived at enough concreteness yet to have confidence in that level of savings. Let me go ahead, though, and talk about the second objective is to reinforce our values and to encourage work and responsibility. I call it Arkansas Works. There's nothing magical about a name, but I think Arkansas Works is descriptive of where we want to go. When you're talking about the expanded population, you're looking at those that are making up to 138% of the federal poverty level. They have this benefit, and the whole design of this benefit is to move them into work, to move them up the economic ladder. So it typifies our objective of an Arkansas Works program. One, it needs to work for the health of our citizens, but also it needs to move them up that economic ladder. The primary elements of this Arkansas Works framework is, first of all, to encourage employer-based insurance rather than a permanent reliance on government insurance. To accomplish this objective, we need to implement mandatory, which I've been told is logistically challenging, and so there's debate whether it should be mandatory or voluntary. I'm continuing to push for mandatory employer-sponsored premium assistance. This means that those that are Medicaid-eligible individuals that have access to cost-effective insurance through their employer needs to take and be enrolled in the employer plan with Medicaid covering the employee's premium and cost sharing that might exceed the Medicaid levels. And so it equalizes that playing field, and it would be acceptable to CMS, and would provide any benefits that are not covered by the employer-based insurance but offered by Medicaid. Not a perfect solution, but it is estimated by the Manette Group that the savings could approach up to $29 million per year, and that would depend upon the level of participation in the employer-sponsored insurance and the number of employer-sponsored plans that are out there that would meet the quality and effectiveness that we need to meet the standards that we would set. The state should also look at additional incentives for employer-based insurance coverage and should consider a Section 1332 waiver to more effectively use the SHOP exchange to provide cost-effective insurance for a larger number of employers. That's just another thing that ought to be looked at as we move forward, the objective being to encourage employer-based insurance and not to gut employer-based insurance, because the employee who has the employer-based insurance available says, I'm better off financially if I stay on the government insurance. And so that is a significant change that would require a waiver, but it has been implemented in other states. I think it is the right direction for Arkansas. Secondly, we need to incentivize work, and we need to do that by having work training referral requirements, along with continued discussion with the administration in Washington on the need for work requirements. And this, let me emphasize, would only apply to those that are able-bodied. And so if you're capable of working, you're able-bodied, you're healthy, and you ought to go through worker training. And that's something that we've got to build, that system for automatic worker referral training for those that are on the expanded population and are healthy. We want to look for incentives or enhanced coverage options or other incentives for those who are in compliance and who meet the goals of a healthy, active Arkansas. We want to encourage the principles of a healthy, active Arkansas for better ownership of your health, better health care management, doing annual checkups, making sure that you have those objectives in place and incentives for those, because that is in addition to keeping them healthy for work and incentivizing work. The third element is personal responsibility, and this again includes a healthy, active Arkansas emphasis and incentives to accomplish that. I have advocated for premium payments required for those with incomes above 100% of the federal poverty level, similar to the marketplace. And so eventually, if you get above 138% of the federal poverty level, you're going to move on to the marketplace. You're going to have to pay up to 2% of your income for premiums. Similar fashion, those that are above 100%, let's have a requirement that they would pay a premium payment as well, up to 2% of their income. This has been done in other states, waivers successfully achieved, and we could look at other waivers requested that we might request that would include some contribution for those above 50% of the federal poverty level. I want to be very sensitive here. It should not be in terms of making it more difficult for them to meet the standards, but we could look at an encouragement for a Healthy Active Arkansas. For example, the premium is waived if they do their wellness exams every year. So that's the kind of incentives that we ought to look at if we're going to look at that 50% to 100% of FPL. Now, what do you do if they don't pay the premium? Accountability is important, but it has to be accountability that is workable and does not increase the uncompensated care for our hospitals or increase costs to the state from an administrative standpoint. To be achievable, all of these waivers, they have to be, we have to make our case in Washington that it fits within the constraints of the law, but then secondly, we have to show that they are workable from an administrative standpoint, and so this is going to be a continued area of negotiation with Washington, but also developing our capability to administer these type of personal responsibility requirements. The fourth aspect is program integrity. You all have really talked about that, drawn a lot of attention to it, and I applaud you for your voice on this. We need to start the debate on restrictions on coverage or increased cost sharing for those with substantial assets. For example, if someone has a primary residence of over $200,000 or those with cash or cash equivalents above a certain level, there's no restriction, there's no asset testing right now for those that go on the expanded population. And I would like to be able to push this administration, the next administration, to reevaluate that. Currently, this restriction is not allowed under federal law, so it's sort of a non-starter in terms of negotiation with this administration, but I think that's something that we can look at down the road to move in that direction to make sure that those that are on the system are not abusing it, but there's enough flexibility to make sure that we cover those that are trying to move up the economic ladder. We should look at a cap on length of coverage for those that are not participating in work opportunities or who are able-bodied. And let me emphasize that this is for those that are able to work, that are trained for work, but they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, or they're not participating in worker training. Then how long do you want to keep them on government-sponsored insurance? If you look at the TANF recipients, they have a cap on how long they can do that because it's designed as a temporary assistance. I think we need to look at, for those that are able-bodied, is this a temporary assistance for them until they get into the workforce and get access to employer-based insurance? That's something we can continue to look at. It's not permissible now, but this is something that we can raise for the short term, but also look at it from a longer term aspect if the next administration changes their view on these requirements. We need to eliminate the 90-day retroactive eligibility. And right now, of course, and let me emphasize that if someone signs up and is eligible for their the Medicaid expansion, then that goes into effect right now 90 days back, 90 days look back, which is different than any other commercial insurance policy that you have. But even if you say you're not going to have that 90-day look back, it would still be effective the day they sign up. So even though they're approved later on, it would be retroactive to the day they signed up for it, and I think that is a fair balance. But I think that would help our program as well. And then, as we have right now, if the federal government changes the match rate down the road, that we find out that it's going to drain our general revenues anymore, we need to have the ability to exit the waiver with appropriate notice and wind down plan. And so those are an outline of how we can achieve savings. It is an outline of the elements of Arkansas Works that I would like to be able to present to the administration and start working on the waivers that are needed to achieve that objective. And if we can achieve those objectives and we can achieve those savings, then we are in a good position as a state to recommend to the legislature that we continue coverage of the expanded population, which I believe is important. I would like to have your support today. I'm asking for your support for allowing my administration to begin the process of negotiating waivers with CMS, technically an amendment to the waivers from CMS, to accomplish the objectives of Arkansas Works. It is a beginning of a discussion. It is beginning a negotiation. It is something that I would be required and obviously want to do to report back to you as to the progress of those negotiations. And from a timeline perspective, this task force has done an extraordinary job. You've worked hard, you've done your due diligence, but right now it is time to make a decisive statement giving me the authorization to pursue these waivers that are needed. If we do not have that authorization today, then that's going to put us behind the curve. If you look at the process of obtaining a waiver from CMS, we develop a concept paper once we give your blessing today. We then will set up meetings with CMS at the staff level in January. I will talk to Secretary Burwell. We've already arranged to have a meeting in January where I'll be able to start the discussion on the waiver process. We will then have a detailed plan drafted, which would be in the January to April time frame. I expect this task force to meet again to review the detailed plan on the waivers, hopefully to bless those again. And then we will have to have legislative approval. And so the task force will move with their recommendation to the full legislature in a special session, because before we actually present the waiver, the formal waiver for approval at CMS, we need to have legislative support for that. So there's many steps to take, and if we do that in the April time frame, then public notice, submission of the waiver to CMS, it takes them many months to evaluate that. We'd be hopeful that we could have a decision by them in October of 2016 where we can begin the implementation, and if you don't begin then, you're way behind the curve because we've got a deadline where the current waiver expires December 31 of 2016. And so time is of the essence in that regard. Time is also of the essence in terms of the savings, but we've got a little bit more time to work out the concreteness of that proposal. And so I would like to have support from the task force to pursue the waivers under the Arkansas Works framework, and then secondly, a commitment that we work together from the task force to find the $835 million in savings over 5 years that is needed to support the expanded population. That's what I need from you today, and I pledge to work with you to find those savings. There's different ideas on the table. I've put my ideas out. I'd like to continue to work with industry and with you to accomplish those savings, and whatever solution we come up with needs to be independently verified, again, so that we know that we're not just engaging in wishful thinking, but there's some concreteness to the savings that we expect. Finally, before I turn it over for questions, the Supreme Court many times comes down with a 5-4 decision. And a 5-4 decision is met with continued debate. I think it's important that we demonstrate to Arkansas that this task force has come together and that we are unified in approaching these waivers for on the condition of finding the savings. We should be together on that. We should be able to send a signal to Arkansas that we're unified in a bipartisan way as well as unified as a task force as whole. So I'm not asking for a 5-4 vote. I'm asking for a strong vote that demonstrates to Arkansas that we understand where we need to go as a state and that we're ready to take the next step in pursuing the waivers as outlined in Arkansas Works. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor. As he said, members, he will entertain questions. We've got a couple on the list. This standard disclaimer, I'd ask that you keep your questions concise and allow opportunity for others to get in if they want to. And I just want to start with a couple. I think you touched on it, but I want to be clear about a couple of things. The first one, you mentioned the $835 million in savings. You've not specified the method that those savings would necessarily be achieved. In fact, you've demonstrated, you've talked about a couple different methods that are already being finalized with long-term care, nursing homes, and dental. I guess what I'm asking you is, you don't really have a required method, whether it be managed care, whether it be a hybrid, or whether it be in-state management of this process. You are open to any of those possibilities, so long as the $835 million is real and is generated under what you're asking of the task force.
That is correct. My top priority, and really only priority, is a savings of $835 million. And now, obviously, it's not savings at any cost. It has to be where we are effectively delivering the services to the consumer. So that's a given. But within that, we have to have $835 million of savings, and I'm agnostic as to how we achieve those savings. Agnostic might be a little bit of a strong word, but perhaps I should say I'm open to any means of achieving those savings.
Okay. Second question I have is, I think you again kind of touched on this, but I think it's important for the task force to keep in mind what you talked about as far as timeline goes. As you went through your framework for what an Arkansas Works waiver would look like, I know the members of this task force, and I know the members of the General Assembly, there's some of those items that people don't like. And there's some of those items that they would prefer not even be on the table for discussion. But I think it's important for us to understand, if there is no, if we do not come to an agreement that you have authorization or support of this task force to go and start these negotiations and this discussion, and if there is no waiver amendment agreed, compromise or path forward agreed to, what happens to Medicaid expansion?
It ends on December 31, 2016.
So if those discussions do not start in the next 30 to 60 days, it practically will be impossible to go through any process to have any type of Medicaid expansion beyond that.
It would be a cliff in which we would have to disengage the coverage for the expanded population of about 200,000 plus. And, you know, without some plan for additional waiver, obtaining the waiver and starting that in January, we've got a real problem in this state.
Okay. And again, we've got right now 5 on the list, so please keep your, particularly those that aren't on the task force, keep your questions, you know, concise and to the point. First one is Representative Mayberry. You're recognized.
Yes, Representative Mayberry.
Can you hear me now? There we go. Thank you. With all due respect, Governor, I'm asking this question on behalf of families that have been waiting on a Medicaid waiver list for 8, 10 years, and they have been told the last few years that community first choice option would be the way to go and it would solve that problem. And then they were told at the beginning of this year that's not the solution and this task force would address that. And I don't see that being addressed, and those families want to know, how does this solve that problem? And can you share with them what you want to tell them? Because I can promise you there are many families that are anxiously waiting to hear what you have to say on that issue.
Well, thank you, Representative Mayberry. And it is a real problem. It is a challenge that we have to face. It is a separate and distinct issue from the waiver for the expanded population. Very appropriate for you to bring it up, but I do want to separate those two different issues. And so that's something that, you know, we can support the initiative that I've talked about today, task force, and come back and continue to readdress that, as I will have to do in my administration. And so please be assured that that discussion is not off the table, that we need to continue that discussion and resolve the path forward on that in the near future.
Senator Rapert, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Governor, thank you for your comments and your leadership in this arena. This may be a little bit of a follow-up to Representative Mayberry. I will say, her having said this, that I have stated in regards to that population that I would love to see our state handle that issue at the same time as we're taking care of our HDCs. And I want to make sure your administration has been very kind to visit with many of us about the HDC issue, Human Development Centers. When you identify $232 million from the DD population, I just want to make sure for members that may not have had a discussion with me or with you, that is not a cut to what we're doing in the Human Development Center arena, though we do intend to fully look at that issue more in depth in the future. Is that so, or am I misunderstanding?
No, Senator Rapert, you are correct, and let me thank you for your leadership on this and your willingness to work with us on it. We've met, we've discussed it. I share your concerns and the need for a solution there. And so when we talk about the savings from the disability population and the behavioral health population, that would not impact directly the human development centers, and we need to have a different solution there that we've discussed, and we need to continue to evaluate. So, you know, there obviously is we're going to have to address that in terms of overall savings and in terms of making sure those human development centers remain strong. That's the commitment I have, is that we don't foreclose that opportunity. Even though there's other options out there, we want to make sure that they are a viable option, and we're going to have to address that separately.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll just close my remarks by saying that, and I'll say this to you, Governor, you didn't create the ACA, and neither did the Arkansas legislature. And we all have been having to respond to a lot of things that we really did not want to have to deal with as a result of decisions made in Washington. And I appreciate the conservative approach that you're now taking, and the opportunity to save $843 million or $835 million, whatever it may end up being, is something I think is good for us. Thank you, sir.
Senator Chesterfield, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, Governor.
Good morning.
It's good to see you again. Governor, there is great angst over the $835 million figure that is being proposed. You have identified those areas that have, with which you are pleased, with what they have proffered as far as savings. There are other groups who have also proffered suggestions that would show you how much they could save, but they are not recognized in this body. Could you tell me how you plan on assuaging my concern that the 835 of unidentified savings would not lead to managed care for those entities?
Well, I assuage your, well, I hope to give you confidence that...
Not de minimis confidence.
I want to give you confidence that, you know, I could be in here today saying that it's my way or the highway, which I might lose on, but, you know, I'm not saying that. I want to work with you to achieve the savings. And there's some, it's got to be credible savings. One option is, and I haven't advocated managed care across the board. You know, I have said that because, you know, virtually every group's come in and said, we put these savings on the table. Most of them are very credible. We just need a little bit more time to work through and make sure that they're independently verified and we have the details of that. But in terms of the developmentally disabled population and the behavioral health population, what has been presented to me thus far is not a reasonable means of achieving the savings. It's not going to
So
work.
it's not the savings, it's the means by which the savings are achieved?
No,
Which is it?
it is the savings. Well, it has to be credible to achieve the result. If we can do it by industry best practices and agreements with industry, I'm all for that. So that is an acceptable solution. And so, you know, it is this task force that has to give a stamp of approval. There has to be legislative approval, and so that is a battle that is faced down the road as to how we're going to achieve those savings. If we can't reach an agreement, we might have to have some very tough votes on that. I hope that we can come to an agreement amongst ourselves as well as with industry. I know that Representative Gray and others have made a presentation yesterday, and I think they had you know, a dental managed care in the mix, and that's an agreement that they worked with the industry. You know, we hope that we can work together with Representative Gray and with others on this task force to reach mutually agreeable consensus on how to achieve those savings.
So by voting to give you the authority to seek the $835 million for the record, is not us saying then that we are in favor of managed care for any of these providers except those that have willingly said so, like the dental industry, and that what you are doing is to, how did we get to the 835?
Well, the 835 is
It's what's going to be needed when we lose the 5% of the 10%. Is that?
Yes, the 835 would be what we're going to have to ultimately pick up when it gets to the 10% over the years. So that is both what the John Stephen report and what we've independently verified as the amount. So that's consensus on what we've got to achieve in savings. And if we didn't achieve that savings, one, we shouldn't vote for the expanded population. And if you did vote for the expanded population without achieving that savings, that means we're going to be cutting everything from pre-K to everything else that's dear in our hearts in general revenues. So we've got to achieve those savings. But you are absolutely correct that if you support what I've requested today, you have not endorsed managed care. You have endorsed that we've got to work together to achieve $835 million in savings.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Ingram, you're recognized.
Governor, we appreciate you coming down in front of the legislative body and this health task force that's worked long and diligent trying to make a recommendation that makes sense for the people of Arkansas. Let me understand, when you're talking about seeking permission for going forth for the waiver, is it your contention that you couldn't do that, that you need permission from this task force to seek that waiver?
Well, I can continue the discussion. I've already had discussions with Secretary Burwell. I've briefed her on my outline of Arkansas Works. But one, it's very expensive. We're going to have consultants and others spend money to develop the waiver language. And so, and we don't have the credibility to negotiate effectively with the administration on these points without having some legislative credibility and support for the initiative. And so, technically, yes, but in wisdom and prudence, it would not be effective, and we need to have your support for it.
Well, it's good to know that CMS respects the legislature, I guess.
They care deeply about you.
The second thing is, the things that you outlined, for instance, long-term care came in and offered to fine $250 million. And John Stevens probably going to have to pull this up. I was just wondering what percentage that savings is of the overall budget that is spent in long-term care. John, if you just make a note. And then I would be interested to know that the cuts that are being made in developmentally disabled and behavioral health, what percentage of that budget that it makes up? Because, I mean, it looks like to me that their budget, I think, John, am I right, is about $900 million apiece. Aren't we talking about $1.8 billion, somewhere there? And I'd be interested to see what percentage that is of the budget. So I guess with you having met and visited, and very persuasive to seek $250 million in cuts, is it your contention that mental health and developmentally disabled, just didn't bring anything to the table, weren't willing to bring anything to the table? I mean, why are they being treated different than anybody else here, would be my question.
Well, you know, in an ideal world, they would come to the table and we'd reach a mutual agreement on savings that could be achieved, and then you know, it's not my opinion as to whether what they're suggesting is reasonable and doable. It is really what John Stephen Group would say. They would evaluate their proposal and say, yes, this will achieve the results, or no, this is not credible. And not just John Stephen Group, would be utilizing the DHS consultants, Manette Group, that would evaluate it as well. So we need an independent verification these amounts are accurate and reliable. What they've presented to me thus far, one, is we haven't had time to evaluate it. And so that's one of the reasons I'm saying we need a little more time to arrive at the consensus on the means of achieving the savings. But secondly, I'll just give you one example. Their proposal was they were taking credit, saying just cut the contract with McKinsey Group. So, you know, you cut the contract with the McKinsey Group, one that's a one-year savings, and they're taking credit for it as, well, this means we're saving money in the industry in the delivery of Medicaid services. So, to me, that's not credible. Now, there's others that are more credible and is workable, so we just got to have longer to work with them. Ultimately, if they don't put on the table savings, then we've got to consider other options. But let's first work with industry and see what they can do and whether it's independently verified. But as others have said, if we can't verify the savings, then we ought to look at managed care because we don't have much other choice there.
Well, I mean, it looks to me that there is a belief that maybe the consultant and you obviously share, that there is much more money to be found in savings there percentage-wise than there is in nursing homes. The one thing I think we have to be very, very careful is we can be penny wise and pound foolish and cut programs that ultimately save us money in the long term because you're working with children and especially children with autism. You're investing in savings down the road, and I hope that that's being considered. Thank you.
Good point, and I agree with you. And that's whether you do whatever type of savings, you need to have the assurance that the services are going to be provided and we're going to meet the needs of the children of our state. If you did it in a voluntary way, you can work toward that assurance. If you did it in a managed care way, the key is the RFP. And let me assure you that if we did develop an RFP, it would be with a great deal of care and looking out for the delivery of those services to make sure it's in the right way. But we're not there yet, so don't think you're voting on that yet.
Governor, what's your schedule? We've still got 5 or 6 on the queue here. I want to know what your schedule is as far as availability time here.
I'm available, you know, so if we can take more questions, great, but I also yield to the chair as to your agenda.
What we're going to do, members, is, again, we're going to, for those, in case you think you're out of queue, we're going to take task force members' questions first, and if we run up against the time, then we want to make sure the task force members get their questions in. So next is Representative Hammer. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Governor, when you go to discuss with CMS the terms of the waiver, you're going to be using as the basis of those discussions the ideas that have come out of this task force, which would be, and it is an ugly term, but it's a term, managed care versus some in-state options. Is that a fair statement?
Well, when I discuss with CMS, we'll first talk about the waivers that are needed for the personal responsibility, the employer-sponsored insurance, the work referral requirements. Those type of waivers will be the first part of the discussion. Ultimately, when we determine exactly how we're going to arrive at the savings, that's a separate path because that's the traditional Medicaid, not the expanded population. And so we would be then going with them, and we need to do that again fairly quickly next year. We would go to them and say, this is how we intend to achieve savings in the traditional Medicaid budget, the larger part of the pie, and we certainly need to have their approval for whatever we do.
So the nature of the discussion isn't going to be so much about the nuts and bolts of how we're going to arrive at that, because that's something that we'll still have to be in the process of working through back here in the state while you're negotiating with CMS. Fair?
That is correct. I will not be engaged in discussions with them on the $835 million of savings until we arrive at a consensus within this group and the administration.
And who will be with you when you're negotiating with CMS, when you have those face-to-face meetings? Who you plan on taking from the legislative branch with you?
I will, you know, if tradition follows any path, we've previously had Senator Hendren, Representative Collins, I think you've been there as well. And so actually I yield, and I see the speaker is here and the president pro tem, so I generally call them and say, I've got 2 legislators that I need, who do you want? And I allow the leadership to designate from each body who should go.
Would you be open to the suggestions, if the chairs would allow, that perhaps, given all the discussion, and this is not an indictment against anybody's judgment or credibility, but so that we could have someone who might represent one side, perhaps the managed care side, but also would represent the in-state side, if the chairs would allow? Would you be open and receptive to taking a couple of folks with you?
To the extent that it's practical and when that is the topic. Again, the first topics will not be the savings side, but will be the waiver side on the expanded population. But at the appropriate time, it's helpful to me, I'll put it this way, it's helpful to me to have the legislative body engaged and hearing personally from the administration as to what can and can't be done. Secretary Burwell has been very, very good. She's got Arkansas connections. She's from West Virginia. She understands the South. She understands the legislative process. And so and she yields to me in the sense of, it's your meeting, who do you want there, as long as it's not cumbersome. So I think it's always a help for me in the discussions to have legislative representation there.
And then finally, when you negotiate the terms of what you're going for, or as you're dealing with CMS, with the framework of the Arkansas Works and all those things you hope to negotiate in the waiver and everything, then out of that, while we're back here working on, which way are we going to achieve that $835 million, then that actually is going to become the framework for the RFP that would be put out in order for us to decide which way we're going to go about securing, because we can all talk about $835 million in savings, but the reality is when somebody's willing to put their name to the line, whether that be on the provider side or that be on the, on the company, and I could envision that we would write a strong contractor RFP that might discourage some folks from even wanting to be involved in the process. Would you see that as the way that this would play out?
Yes. Whatever conclusion you have on how we arrive at $835 million in savings, we would have to draft RFPs, whether it's simply for the dental side or whether it's for other aspects of achieving those savings, and I certainly expect the legislature to have a voice in reviewing that.
And finally, do you think you could influence Ms. Burwell to come down to Arkansas, being that she's that fond of the legislative branch? She might come entertain us with her company?
Well, if you treat her as nicely as you treated me, then I'm sure she'd want to come.
You can let her know we'll treat her nice. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Sanders, you're recognized.
Governor, if you could, gave a great deal of specificity on the reforms that you're looking at doing on premium assistance and private option. Can you give us, or have someone on your staff give us, sort of the underlying math and sort of the assumptions that are being made in terms of the savings numbers on that? And is it also your intention that once we get off sort of the bright, shiny object of what we do with the expanded population, and we look at, the other $4.8 billion program that's there, that you will come back with a high degree of specificity about, what really the path forward looks like, and it's, is that what you're thinking?
Indeed. And Senator Sanders, you've been a great asset in terms of your expertise on this, and some of the you know, if you're talking about an incentive, like, for example, dental insurance under circumstances to encourage behavior, there's a cost to the state. And so we do have to measure each one of these. So first, I'd want to see what is doable within the administration. If they say, yes, we can do something like that, then we'd want to put a cost figure with it, obviously report back. And let me just come back real quick on the $835 million. I want to provide leadership where it is helpful. And so you know my specific plan as to how to achieve the $835 million. And so I'm going to show you how it can be done. If you don't like my plan to achieve $835 million, I'm counting on you to come up with a plan that achieves $835 million that is credible and independently verified.
One follow-up, if I could. I think it's very important because involving your administration, when we get to the reforms of the broader Medicaid program, do you think it would be helpful if we also put some benchmarks in place of how the reforms sort of unfurl through the process? Let me give you an example. I mean, we've sat in these rooms before, and all the people in the back of the room have been here, and we've pursued major strategies at targeted savings. And what happens is they'll shut it, they being the providers in many instances, and there are some good ones who've been good partners, but they'll shut it down through the regulatory process, or they'll shut it down in they'll get a vote in a committee, just as we have in triggers with regard to the private option. If the federal government changes the rules in terms of money, what if some of the providers who come in and agree to certain things, and we get agreements, and then they start backing away as those policies and changes are implemented? Don't you think it would be beneficial to us that we have maybe some protections in there and say, if this, then this?
Absolutely. I agree 100%. There's a couple ways you can achieve that. First of all, if the savings are not achieved as agreed to, then there's been one suggestion that there's a lockbox or there's a payment made in so that we can guarantee that those savings are achieved. So that's one option, but the other one is just a clear understanding, and it's been expressed here, that if the commitment is not made that the savings are achieved, you're looking at draining general revenues. And I think everyone would agree to say that's not a good path, and so you've got to look at how you can then take the next step to achieve those savings.
Yeah, I think what I'm talking about is even before we get to savings targets, in terms of everyone agreeing to a certain set of facts and how things are going to be implemented. Because I mean we've seen it several times where, you know, before we even can get to implement the policy is stopped. So I think I'm talking about even going back a little bit further, you know, there are a lot of folks been around here for a long time and know how to maneuver quite well. I think it's just a consideration that we should make moving forward.
Good point. Let me assure you that as much authority as you give me in the executive branch to carry out these initiatives, I'll run with it. And I also would point out that we really need your great help. For example, the RFPs and contracts and things like that. With the legislative review, that adds time. And so...
and an obstacle. I mean, just being honest, it adds an obstacle.
From my standpoint, it does. I would rather have your work on this in advance and working with you as we draft it, but don't slow it up on the tail end of things.
Senator Bledsoe, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Governor, a lot of the focus has been on managed care and the $835 million. But if the vote today, as you answered Senator Chesterfield, does not mean support for managed care, does the vote today mean that we support continuing the coverage for the Medicaid expansion population, or does it mean that we support you going to Washington and negotiating with CMS and then coming back and letting us know what waivers will they allow, and then letting us vote. How do you see this vote today on the expanded Medicaid population?
Well, it all depends upon the language of the motion that would be presented by the committee, but I would like to have the support of this task force authorizing the governors to negotiate waivers from the Center for Medicaid Services consistent with the Arkansas Works Framework, and that we agree that a minimum of $835 million over 5 years need to be saved from the Medicaid budget, and we support further efforts to identify those savings. That's the kind of support that I need coming out of here with a strong bipartisan vote. And in terms of your question specifically, obviously, I'm going to be pursuing certain waivers. I will come back, and the legislative delegation will be engaged in those conversations, so you will be aware of what the final analysis is. If two of our waivers that we can't get or two of our ideas are crushed, then obviously both this task force will have an opportunity to consider where we are, as well as the full legislature.
All right. Thank you, Governor.
Representative Flowers, you're recognized.
Just the young. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Governor. Given, earlier you mentioned the possibility of going off the cliff. And that said, given the implications of, and the importance of your pursuit of these waivers, according to the Arkansas Works Framework, I'm wondering, first, do you know whether or not any of the waivers that you'd be pursuing have been denied in any other states, especially as some of them are nuanced according to how they might work in Arkansas, according to your plan? And then secondly, do you have a total estimated figure as to what those waivers would amount to in cost savings for the state?
We have asked for analysis of the financial impact of the various waivers in terms of the employer-based insurance. Depending upon how it's implemented, that could save up to $29 million per year. And that would require a 1115 waiver. In terms of incentive, and that has been done in, accepted in another state, so I think that is within the parameter of what could be accepted by CMS. On incentivizing work, the work training referral requirements, that has been accepted in other states as well. In my discussion with Secretary Burwell, I think that is doable. In terms of the cost impact of that, we're looking at the impact on workforce services, because they do the training, and you could have thousands that are referred over for training, and so that is something we've got to manage. I don't have any other specifics on that at this point. That's very doable, and I expect that to be approved. On the personal responsibility side, the premium payments above 100% of FPL, that has been approved in other states. I think that's doable. That is not a cost impact to the states. On every one of those, there is a administrative challenge, and that's what we will be evaluating immediately after you all sign off on this, because, you know, if somebody doesn't do their premium payment, what's the consequence? How do you collect that? You know, many instances it might be a debt to the state that if they have a tax refund due, it could be collected at that point. So we've got to work through that, but that's something that CMS is very open to. You know, in terms of the program integrity side of it, you know, it's almost aspirational when I talk about an asset test, So I would expect that that would be told by this administration that's not doable, it's not consistent with law, and they don't approve it. So that's very likely to be my report back to you, but I like to put it on the table because it's helped shape policy for the future. And so some of those other program integrity aspects, you know, are new, and it's unknown as to whether they would agree to that or not.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, it'll be soon that I will need to depart.
Governor, I just had one question. I want to make sure that I understand when we're talking about the numbers, because you've made the linkage between the $835 million and the private option, and I track with you that when we get the $835 million, the new program, Arkansas Works, becomes no net new general revenue to the cost structure. But I also want to make sure that we understand, if we were to say, well, gosh, why don't we just eliminate the Medicaid expansion, then we don't have the need for any savings, that in fact we're creating a new hole, and that from the Stevens report on pages 5 and on page 23, where they talk about the uncompensated care, if we were to end the Medicaid expansion, we would not need only $835 million in savings. We would need $438 million for the direct costs, and then $1.072 billion for uncompensated care to hospitals. So we would need to come up with $1.5 billion in savings. Just so we don't get confused and think if we just eliminate the Medicaid expansion, we've solved our spending challenges. And I just wanted to make sure that I'm in sync with you, sir.
Representative Collins, you have expressed it precisely correctly. And I would just say that if we did not do this, we would have one challenge in a physical session. Might not be this year, but we would have it.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, that's all I have on the list. Senator Ingram, you asked me, and I'll just pass it on. I think the governor covered that just a few moments ago about the framework of the Arkansas Works waiver. Do you have other questions on that, or was that?
I'd just like a handout so we can all see what we're going to be voting on. I'm sure it's written down somewhere.
Yes. The outline that I presented this from, be happy to make that available to you. And of course, if there's any questions, please holler at me because I can talk it through with you.
Okay. All right, we'll get that to you as soon as we can. What I'd like to do right now is, and we typically do this after the governor speaks to let the room clear out a little bit, we're going to take about a 10-minute break. Then the task force will reconvene and take up items on the agenda. Governor, thank you for coming. Thank you for your presentation and bearing through all these questions. We appreciate it. You all, we're recessed for 15 minutes.